Hello everyone and welcome to the walkthrough video for week number 4. This week we are talking models. This video is going to be a walkthrough of part of this week's lab. So this week's lab, step 1, is to create the MVC music store application as mentioned in your book. The balance of this video will actually walk through that tutorial. Step number 2 will be creating a new MVC application named enrollment application with a lot of the same concepts that we're going to learn here in our video. Step 3 is to check in both projects into GitHub and share the commit ID. And then finally submit screenshots to or put them in a Word document and submit them to Blackboard Learn. All right, well let's begin with the tutorial. I already have a copy of Visual Studio up and open, and we're going to create a brand new project. So File, New, and then Project. And I'm going to create an ASP.NET web application using the .NET framework. And I'm going to call it MVC Music Store Application. And make sure you call it precisely this, otherwise you will have some potential issues later on. I also want you to note that I'm storing it in the same location where I keep my repository, and that'll help facilitating putting it in GitHub later. I'm going to go ahead and click the OK button. And next we're going to talk about what kind of templates we're going to use. This is definitely an MVC app. We're going to use the project template for MVC and click OK. And what's going to happen here is Visual Studio is going to create a brand new solution and a brand new project. And if you look at my status bar at the bottom here, you see the various components that it's adding into my solution. It's adding jQuery, it's adding Bootstrap, it's adding all of the MVC references. And here we go. So we have a sample MVC app, and even though we haven't added any code to it yet, I want to go ahead and build the solution. And the reason why we do this is to make sure that we have everything downloaded and everything's working. So you see my build is successful. I also like looking at any errors, so I'm going to go to view and keep open my error list. So right now I don't have any errors, warnings, or messages. And I actually want to run the application. And this is also another good test just to see if the application is going to work. And I'll close the diagnostics. You don't need to see diagnostics yet at this stage. So when I run it, it opens a new copy of this application in my browser. I'm using Google Chrome as my preferred browser of choice. It's totally up to you which browser you want to use. And so you can see I've got a very simple web application. When we build applications that connect to a database, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. One way is called database first, and as the name implies, that means we're going to create our database and create all of the tables in the database, and then Visual Studio using Entity Frameworks can take that database and its tables and create corresponding models in .NET that mirror that database. The other way to do it is called code first, and that's the method that we're going to walk through today. This is where we're going to create our models in our Visual Studio application, and then it will build the database and the tables for us based on that. Either method works okay. As a personal preference, I like using database first, and the reason why I do that is because often when I'm creating an application, I have a very specific need of how I want that database to look and how I want all the tables to interact. So it's quicker for me to do it that way first. But again, either way is okay. So again, we're going to create a very simple MVC application to manage albums. Each album will have a genre and an artist. And rather than having to retype all of the classes, I've provided them for you in Blackboard Learn. And I've downloaded a copy of the Lab 4 files and I've unzipped it. And we're going to add classes for our album, our artist, and our genre to our solution here. So there's a couple ways that we can do this, and I'm going to show you at least two of them as I go through in this tutorial. So I'm going to go to my repo folder. I'm going to open up my MVC Music Store application, and I'm going to go down to the models directory. So it is currently empty, and I'm going to pick those three models. So again, the album, artist, and genre, and I'm going to copy them over to my models directory. Now when I come back to Visual Studio, you see that models is still not here, or those three files aren't here yet. So we can add them to the project a couple of different ways. So we can right click on models and then say add and then existing item. And then we can navigate to that folder and pick those three items and say add. The other option we can do is there's a show all files button, and I kind of like that. So that shows everything that exists in your Visual Studio projects folders, and we can see album, artist, and genre. They've got the little kind of dotted icons here that lets me know that they're not included as part of the project. So on each of these I can right click on them and say include in project, or I can actually select multiple and right click and do include on project. And you notice right away the icon changes so that they are now C# classes. And I'm going to select show all files again so that we only look at the files that are really part of our solution. So let's take a brief look at these three classes here. So we have an artist class, and in that we have an artist ID. So this is going to be the primary key in the database, and the artist has a name. We're going to go over to genre, and we see genre has an ID. It has a name and a description. And then when we go over to the album class, the album model, you can see it's got an album ID, so that's the primary key for the album. And then it has a genre ID and an artist ID, has title and price, and then it includes actually a copy of our genre class, our genre model, and the same thing for our artist. And then finally a URL where we would store images for that album art. So it's important to have the genre ID here and the genre here, and that is how MVC and Entity Frameworks know to construct the database and how they are going to be linked. So the next thing I want to do is also bring in some images. That way we don't have to worry about images, and also included some CSS. So let me bring that over here. And so I already showed you two ways to add folders or add content into Visual Studio. One of my favorites is just dragging from Windows Explorer to the folder where you want to put it, and we're going to put that in the content folder. And so now when you see it here, we've got our three images that we just added. So we got an images folder and those three images. And then the other thing I want to copy over is the site.css. Now we already have a site CSS, so we're going to go ahead and when we copy it over, we're going to say yes, we want to overwrite that one. Again, I want to pause here to do a build of the application. So we added a bunch of files, and before we get too far along, we want to build to make sure that everything is correct. Now, if when you created your project, you didn't name it exactly MVC Music Store Application, the included model classes would have an error here. So this is why it's important to create using that same name I provided. If not, you have to go into each of those classes and change it here. Now we just added classes and the classes aren't connected yet. So now we're going to add a new controller. And this controller is going to help us build or manage our various albums. I'm going to right click on controllers and say add, and then click on add and then controller. Now we've used an empty controller in the past. This time we're going to pick an MVC controller using views, using the Entity framework. And I'm going to go ahead and click add because this will take a second to do the building. Yeah. So let's pick a model class, and we are going to pick our album model. And our album model, as you can see on the screen, is also going to touch on our genre and our artist. And then we want to create a data context class. I'm going to hit the plus button here. And I'm going to call it, so MVC Music Store DB. And then click add. And then finally, I want to give it a name. And instead of albums, I'm going to call it Store Manager Controller. And now what's happening, similar to when we created a brand new project, Visual Studio is adding additional references. And it's doing what it's called scaffolding. And what that means is it's adding some templates, some boilerplates to our applications that will do a lot of the work for us. So in this application, we want to be able to create a new album, we want to edit existing albums, and we wanted to delete those. That is typically called CRUD, C-R-U-D, create, read, update, and delete. When Visual Studio did the scaffolding, it built a lot of that functionality for us. So our controller is built, our store manager controller is built. We have a few methods here we're going to go into in a little bit. In addition to creating that controller, you can see it created a store manager folder under views. It created our create view. It created our index view, so this is where we're going to see a list of all of our albums. It created our edit, so this is where we would update. It created a delete view and then a details view. And again, we're going to go into that here in a little bit. It also created a new model called the MVC Music Store DB. And this model has references to our album, artists, and genres. And this is going to be part of the go-between between our C# models and our Entity frameworks connection to our database. We haven't built our database yet, but this is the connection for that. So let's take a look at the store manager controller, just see what it does. So here we have a connection to our MVC Music Store database model, and again, that's the connection to Entity Frameworks to our database. We have an index method, and what this index method does is it's going to show all of our albums, and this syntax is using link, using a lambda expression. If you've used SQL syntax in the past, it is very similar. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get a list of albums, and when we pull albums, we're also going to include the artist and the genre. And then we're going to have a view that shows all of those albums. So let's switch over to the view for our index here. So up the top we have a table, and then in our the first row here, it's going to have the list of um, the names of each column. So what it does here is it's actually going to pull what's the name for the artist, what's the name for the genre, title, price, and then the album URL. And then in this section here, it's going to loop through all of the albums in our model, and then it's going to display that particular album's uh, artist name, genre name, title, price, and its URL. And it's going to provide links that allow us to edit that existing album, view details on it, and then delete it. Let's go back to the Store Manager controller. We have a details method, and what that's going to do is it's going to show information for a single album. We have two create methods, and we're going to talk about create here in a little bit. We have two edit methods, and we're going to talk about edit here in a bit, and then finally two delete methods, and finally a dispose method. Now again, I want to stop here, and I want to build this application just to make sure that, again, everything is working, everything is connecting. And I want to run this application. And the application is going to look the same. So we haven't really changed anything yet. But if we go to our new Store Manager controller, Store Manager, it takes a little bit here. So I'm going to talk about what .NET is doing behind the scenes here. But it created a view here. Again, it's got names for our album and our artist, titles, price, but there's no data yet. All right, so let's close our browser and go back to our application. I want to cover one other thing that the scaffolding did, and that is that it created a connection to a database. And let's go into our web config here, and you'll see a new section here called connection strings, and it created a brand new connection called MVC Music Store DB, and it's saving that using my local copy of SQL Server Express called MVC Music Store DB with that number here. And if you look at this, you can actually say this is the year, month, day, time when this was created. This is kind of one of the reasons why I like doing a database first, is because I need to have the database a specific database name. But again, if I wanted to, I can change that at any point doing database or code first. Now, MVC, when we do this method, by default, it's going to create a brand new database the first time the application runs. And not only the first time it runs, but the first time that we browse to the store manager. So really the first time it needs to connect to this database, it's going to connect to SQL Server Express and it's going to build our application. Let me open up Server Explorer and let's go to our our data connections. Let's see. Let's see if it'll get connected here. There we go. So I had to right click and hit refresh on our data connections. So now you see my database, MVC Music Store DB. And in there we have a handful of tables. I'm going to ignore migration history for now. But we have albums, artists, and genre. And when we look at, oops, let's see if we can get reconnected here. All right, sorry about that. We're back now here. So I did a refresh on data connections to see my various data connections. We have our MVC music store database, and then we have our four tables. Three of those correspond to each of our models. So if I look in album, I see our album information here, our artist, and our names here as well. And I want to take a look at some of these tables here. And if I right click on, say, genres, and if I right click and hit show table data, we can see that there is no information in there yet. But let's add a couple of genres and artists here. So the genre ID, like I mentioned earlier, is automatically generated, so we don't want to put anything in there, but we want to put something in both name and description. And then you see as soon as I hit tab, it automatically populates that, the genre ID with number one. And then so just some random data in here. Next, I want to create a couple new artists. Again, right click on the table name, click show um, um, show table data, and let me see, say Jay-Z, Beatles. It doesn't really matter here. And then finally, let's add a couple of albums here. So right click on albums, show table data. So again, the album ID is going to be automatically generated, but I'm going to have to populate the genre and the artist. And I know that I put two entries in each, so I'm going to say this one is the first genre, the first artist, and again, I'm just putting in dummy data here. Green URL. Consistency is important. All right. So we added data to each of our tables here, and then we're going to run our application. And it's going to open up a copy of Chrome, navigate to our store manager, and you can see the different albums that I put in. Actually got an error putting that in. Um, so I either didn't save one of my genres or I didn't save one of my artists. But that's why we have the three albums there instead of the four albums. So now that we have some data in here, let's kind of take a look, closer look at our views here. So this is our index view, and we went over this a little briefly, but again, so it shows the column headers here. So this is the artist name, the genre name, album title, price, and the album art URL. And then for each album, it shows those records. And then we have a few links for each item. So we have an edit, a details, and a delete. And I want you to notice when I hover over each of these, look at the link URL down below. So when I hover over edit, it's going to our store manager controller, our edit method, and it's going to pass an ID of 1. And if I scroll or take the next one, it's going to pass 2, it's pass 3. Same thing with details. The store manager controller or details method 1, 2, and 3, and then finally the same thing for delete 1, 2, 3. Let's go ahead and change our items. So when I go to edit, so I get my list of genres from the database. I get my list of artists from the database. I can change my title here. I can put in a new price and change the URL, and then click save. If I go to details for that, so details is a very simple view, just shows the raw data. I can go back to my list, or I can go to the edit screen from here. And then finally, if we hit delete, it's going to show the data that we have, and again, I can go back to the list or I can delete that. Again, Visual Studio did all of this for us, and we really haven't had to create much code yet. So let's take a look here at our data connection here. I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to look at our tables here. So we didn't do any genre or artist changes, but we did do some album changes here. So I'm going to right click and show table data. And so I deleted one album, and I changed one of my albums. I changed the title and I price and URL. So Visual Studio or MVC by default, it creates a database only if it doesn't exist. Sometimes it's helpful to have it always create a brand new database every time the database runs, or every time our application runs. And so why would we want to do this? Well, one reason is we would want to do this when we are testing our application, and we want to start with a consistent data set. And in the Lab4 files, we have a sample data CS. So we want to add that to our models. So I'm going to take the easy method of dragging it from our Lab4 files and copying it over to models. And let's go ahead and take a look at this class. So the point of this class here is pretty much to pre-populate the database. So you can see I've got a list of various genres. I've got a long list of artists here and a bunch of albums that pull in genres, prices, and artists. Now, in order for the application to use this, we do have to make a couple of changes. So the first change we're going to have to do is go to our global.asax, and we want to go into our application start method. And this method is going to run pretty much every time our application starts up. Before we add a line here, we want to add a couple of different things, a couple of different usings. So we want to add using system.data.entity. That lets Visual Studio know that this file is going to use Entity Frameworks. And we also want to reference one of our models here. So we want to using using our MVC Music Store application dot models. Now within our application start method, we can call a database dot set initializer, and we're going to pass it a new copy of our sample data. So again, our sample data is a class that will pre-populate our database. And before I run, I want to point out this here. So it inherits the drop create database always. So what this means is every time the application runs for the first time, it's going to drop or delete our database, recreate it based on our models, and then populate with the information here. So let's see that in action. So again, we did make a change here. So I want to build, make sure there are no errors, and then go ahead and run. And again, nothing's going to happen until I get to the store manager controller. But again, we made a change in our application. It takes a bit for MVC and IIS to load it up. So now I go to store manager for the very first time. It's going to try to delete my database, create a brand new database, and then populate it with everything in our sample data class. And that'll take a bit to do that. Now this is a great opportunity to talk about kind of what's going on here. So it was trying to drop the database, but it can't because it's currently in use. So the reason why we got that is because I still have my Solution Explorer or my Server Explorer open, and I'm still connected to that database. So let me see if I can view my Server Explorer, which I may not be able to do because it's still running, and that's okay. So I'm just going to let it continue so I can get my error message here. I'm going to close out of that. I'm going to stop my application. I'm going to go back to Server Explorer, find my database. I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to say close connection. So it's complaining that it couldn't drop that database because a user, in this case me, was connected to that. Now that you know about that, you can make sure you close that connection before you launch your app. So again, let's launch the app. Let's go to the store manager. Again, what it's going to try to do this time is it's going to try to drop that database. It is going to create clean tables, and then it's going to pre-populate all of those tables with the information that we have in our sample data class. Oh, and I see that it is still in use here. And that may be because I have multiple copies of it open, and that's okay too. Um, we'll see if I can just delete it from here and then try running again. So we have our MVC app up here, we have Store Manager, and if it doesn't work this time, then I will pause the video and go fix that connection and then come back. All right, so now that we got our database deleted and we ran our application, you can see now we have a list of all of the albums in for our sample data. So I can go in, I can make changes to our application, and then save that to the database. And then if I stop it, and then I go look in Server Explorer, and then I look in our albums here, and right click and show table data, I'll be able to see my my change here to the title that I made. Now, if I run my application again, then those changes are going to be lost. So that may be again what we want if we're testing like a very specific data set. But maybe we just only want that the first time the application runs. So there's another option that we can do. I'm going to go ahead and actually close my connection here. So, and let's go back to our sample data. So instead of drop creating database always, another option we can do is drop create if model changes. So what this means is that if we changed our data model, so we say we needed to add another field, then the database would only be recreated from scratch if we add something to our model. So, for example, if I went to album and said, say, let's add a new like informational string, so string additional info. So now that I changed my model, if I build and launch my application, it will drop my database and recreate it. Now what I want to do is I want to take a closer look at our controller. So we took a look at our index method, so that gets us the list of all of our albums. Our details method gets in an ID, and I don't know if you've seen this yet. The question mark means it's a nullable variable type. In this case, it's a nullable integer, means that that ID doesn't have to be passed. So if that ID isn't passed, it'll be null, and then we're going to get an error message. Otherwise, we're going to try to find that album by its ID. If we can't find it, we'll say nope, we can't find that page. And if we can find it, then we're going to view that album. And so that album view. So let's go into that's the details view here. So pretty straightforward. So it shows the name of the model artist name. So it shows the name of this column. And then it shows the actual data that belongs to that. So this line would say name, This line here gives the artist's actual name. Same thing for genre. Same thing for titles. So this would say title. This would be the album title all the way down. And then at the bottom, it has an edit link. So it'll create a new action link that will go to our edit method, and it'll pass that current album ID. If we look at our create methods, we have two methods. So the first method here is when we do a get. This is going to be the first time we go to create a new entry. And I want to bring up a browser to show you what we're talking about. So we'll let that run. We'll go to Store Manager. We're going to hit this create new link here. So you can see I have a pretty empty screen, but our genre and our artist are already pre-populated. And so that's what these two lines do. So this one gets us a list of all of the artists from our database. This one gets us a list of genres for our database, and then passes it to that create view. And so this is the create view. We're going to ignore some of the validation stuff for right now. But it's going to show the drop down list. So this line here shows the label for genre. This one shows the actual drop down list for genre. And then for artist, same thing here. So this is the label for artist, and then this is the actual drop down list. Now, once we put information in our item here, so let's say we're going to create Red Album 2. And hit create. Now we're going to do the post method. And so the post method here says pretty much take everything that we have on the screen and save it to the database. So this is going to look to make sure that everything is valid. It's going to add a new album to our entity frameworks model database. It's going to actually persist that to the database. So this is actually where it saves it to the database. So this is a step I see a lot of people miss, is they save it to entity frameworks, and you can call from it, but if you don't actually save it to the database, when you go to look at the database, it won't be there. And then finally, it redirects back to our home page. Otherwise, if for whatever reason the model state is not valid, it's going to reload our list of artists, and it's going to pre-populate the one that we picked. It's going to reload our list of genres. It's going to pre-populate the one we picked, and it's going to go back to the view. So that lets us do our data checking. So let's see that in action here. So I'm going to create new, and I'm going to hit create. So I see like the price is required here. So that's our data validation in action here. Next, we have two edit methods. So edit is very similar to our create methods. So the first method is the get method. This is going to be the first time we click that edit button. And so when that happens, we're looking for an ID. If that ID isn't passed, we're going to show an error to the user. We're going to try to find that album. If we can't find it, we're going to show a different error to the user. We're going to pre-populate our drop-down list, and then we're going to select the one that we have in the database. We're going to do the exact same thing for genre, and then we're going to return that view. And then when we post, this is, again, just like the create method for post. We're going to check to make sure that the model is valid, meaning all the fields are filled in as we expect it to. We're going to say that album was modified. We're going to save all the changes and then go back to the home page. And again, if the model state is not valid, we're going to repopulate our artist and genre with our selected artist and genre and then show the edit view. And then again, the delete view, really similar to create and edit. So when we go to delete, we're looking for that ID. If that ID does not exist, it'll throw an error message. We're going to try to find that ID, and if we can't find it, it's going to return a not found. If it does find it, it's going to show the delete view. And then within that delete view, if they click the delete button, it's going to find it again. It's going to remove it, save it to the database, because again, if you don't save changes, it's not going to persist those changes to the database, and then redirect back to the home page. So I know that was a long video, but hopefully this helps you through the walkthrough of the MVC store application and gives you enough information to build the enrollment application that matches. So again, you want to do the MVC Music Store application like I just did. Create an enrollment application. Make sure you add at least 5 students, 5 courses, and enrollments, and then do screenshots. And as always, if you have questions, post them to the discussion board or send me an email. Otherwise, have a wonderful week. Thanks all.